and welcome to another episode of the Tell Not Show. As always, we are your hosts. We have the gracious and lovely Kirsha Fox. She's the author of Son of Deception and The White Leaf Child. She's a homeschooling mom of four, avid reader, and gamer.
And my co-host is Julia J.K. Allen, editor, author, and author coach. She's a fantasy and horror author who loves to sprinkle magic in everything. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, and we're very excited to welcome our guest tonight. Why don't you go ahead and tell us all about them?
Yes, Bobbie Isabel is a lover of words. She spent her childhood escaping in books and finding solace in the public library. Her career in education circled around language in all of its forms, and she takes all of those experiences into account in her writing. As an adult, she finds healing in poetry, exploring themes such as vulnerability and authenticity in her poems. We're so excited to have her.
Yes, welcome.
Hi there.
Yes, I also, poetry is one of my first loves, so I love that you write poetry as well. I did my senior thesis in it, but I admit that fiction has kind of taken a priority since graduating, and unfortunately, I haven't been keeping up with writing all the poetry and all that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what your journey as a writer has looked like, and what got you started in writing?
Well, it's actually funny that you talked about writing a thesis because I have always been an academic writer. I never thought that I could write creatively. I was like, give me a research project. I'm good. I will write you an essay. I will write you whatever. And while I was writing my dissertation, actually, I was approached by a friend of mine to write a musical. Because I am a big fan of musical theater. And so he had this idea for a musical that they make music together. He has a group of guys that they've been making music together for like 30 years. And he's like, I've had this idea for a musical for about 20 years, and I just didn't know what to do with it. And so we wrote a musical together. And and it's all in poetry. And so from there started the poetry. It was like as soon as the floodgates opened, it was done. I wrote like 800 poems that year, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I put out one book of poetry. The rest are still sitting there waiting for me to figure out what I'm going to do with them. And then it was like, okay, I'm going to do NaNoWriMo and I'm going to write a book, right? I don't know if I'll finish it or not, but I'm going to start writing one. And so I started, writing a book, and I was like, it's going to be part fiction and part nonfiction. And and then when it got done at the end of the month, I was like, you know what? I like the fiction story better. So let me just make that a book. And so I started then revising and drafting. And so I have a fantasy novel that is in the process. I have to finish editing it. I'm waiting for the cover to be finished, so that way my brain will focus on that. And that's just where it started.
Sounds amazing. One of the best experiences of my life was probably seeing Wicked opening year on Broadway. Musical theater is amazing. I can hardly believe you wrote a whole musical. That is not an easy feat. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
That sounds like an amazing project to work on, though. Like, it'd be so fun. What makes you, so poetry, you kind of fell in love with doing this musical and stuff, but what makes you choose fantasy for a genre?
Well, fantasy is one of my favorite genres to read. And so I, like I said, I started writing this book that was part nonfiction and part fiction. It was really kind of a memoir of a really rough time in my life. And the way that I got through it was I had this fantasy world that I would fall into. And so the fantasy went along with it. But then, like I said, as I was writing it, and when I got to the end of those 50,000 words, I was like, you know what? I feel a whole lot better now. I feel a whole lot healed. But I like this fantasy world. And so now I'm going to make it its own thing. And that's really what happened. And so it'll be a trilogy. The character has become her own self. Originally, she was me. And she has now just, taken on a life of her own, and all these other characters, some, based on real people, some just based on, whatever she needed them to be. That's what they became. And so, it just became its own thing.
No, I love that. Writing can be so therapeutic and so cathartic in general.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I love that the world that you found yourself kind of escaping into has just been become its own thing that you're going to write about and share with the world. That's so exciting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's particularly funny when like I notice themes keep coming up in my
Mm-hmm.
own writing, and I have to
Mhm.
stop and say, okay, what am I going through right now? What am I trying to
Right,
tell myself through my characters? And
right.
as they learn, like through their character arc to get over it, I find myself reflecting that same healing in a lot of ways. So,
Hmm.
like writing, I think is wonderful both for the author and the reader. You know, both
Yes,
of you are
Mhm.
on this journey together.
yes, I love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was at an author event the very beginning of March, and somebody was asking me about my books because I don't write in just one genre, right? And I said, well,
Hmm.
it's kind of a progression, right? Like I have a children's book out that I decided to write for my grandbaby. So it's an adventure
Hmm.
story. I said, but the poetry is really about me getting all of these negative feelings out.
Hmm.
They have to go somewhere, and so they go
Right.
into the poetry. I said, the fantasy was about healing, and now she's her own thing. I said, but all of that releases all of that negative energy, so then I can write
Mm.
the fun stuff, which is what I
Right.
write under Leah Lane because
Okay, yeah.
I need to keep all the spicy stuff separate.
Yes.
Right, right. Yes.
So, what does your process look like? How do you go from just idea to like finished product?
Ooh,
Yeah.
that's a hard one. I am a pantser. So depending on what I'm writing, like I said, when it came to the fantasy, it started with that nonfiction. It started with the
Mhm.
memoir and just how did the story fit in there. And then when it became its own thing, it was like, okay, where would she go now? Right? If she were me, where would I want to go to for my own personal growth and development and all of that? So it really is a very character driven, like what is the
Mhm.
character going through right now, where do they need to be, where do they need to go next. Half the time I don't know until I get
Mhm.
there. I don't do a lot of plotting, and one story I woke up out of a dream
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, here's this whole story, planned out, and I went ahead and I typed out all of the outline and everything, and the characters didn't listen. Everything changed. So I was like,
Right.
you know what? We're just not even doing that. So usually I just start with a blank page and I'm like, what would be the first thing that I would say to somebody if I was meeting them for the first time? And most
Mm.
of my romances, that's how they start. Like, just what would that conversation be?
Right. No, that's an
Be-
interesting way of like framing how do we start a new tale is,
Mhm.
well, what would that conversation look like? Yeah.
Mhm.
Do you think there is the most important part of writing? What would you say that is?
The most important part of writing. I would say it is probably just getting the ideas on the page, like getting the
Right.
story out and making sure that there is a story, because I can write a lot of things. I can throw some things together, but that does not a story make, right?
Right.
And so I think it's just important that there's a story and that the story has some kind of flow and that it makes sense. Everything else can be edited and revised,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
if there's no coherence, then it's much harder to put together.
No, I would agree. They always say like you can't edit a blank page, so you absolutely need to
Mhm.
just put something down, even if it's horrible writing, because
Right.
you can always work with that. But I like what you say about like making sure the story is there, because there's a lot of like interesting things we can explore with writing, but not everything's going to make a good story, and not everything needs to be a story if we're just exploring things. Whenever somebody says like that they want to write a book, I always just suggest that like make sure you have enough story for a whole book, because like there's uh, I love how Bilbo Baggins says he feels like too much butter spread over bread. And I feel like sometimes authors do that with stories, though, where they have like one great idea or one super great scene, but they haven't thought of everything to fill it in. And so it kind of spreads thin over all of these words. And you're like, you could have wrote that in a short story and it would have been amazing. But we have these like aspirations to write books. So it's really important when we get those great ideas of making sure we're finding the right format and the right length of words to like put them into, because some things are amazing short stories but would not be enough for a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a good
Absolutely.
friend who's trying to write a novel, and I keep looking and going, you know what? This would make a great children's book. Just select your
Yeah.
best lines, put some beautiful art up there. It would make a great children's book. Like,
Yeah. And you
Hmm.
know they can build up to the novel, but it's like, yeah, sometimes it's
mhm.
like certain stories or ideas are like just more perfectly suited for shorter form writing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, do you feel like you start with characters or you start more with plot? Like you said, you're a pantser, but like your first draft, do you focus more on one or the other?
Um, I don't know that I focus more on one or the other. Like they go
Mhm.
together to me.
Hmm.
There's always like this natural story arc. I think I've read like thousands of books in my lifetime, right? So
Right.
I just kind of have this natural story arc in my head. And so generally, like I said, it starts with a conversation. Like, okay, I'm going to put these two people together. They're going to meet in this random place. What are they going to say to each other? And where does it go from there? So it
Mhm.
starts with the characters, but the characters don't exist without the rest of the story. And the story
Right.
doesn't exist without the characters. And so I don't necessarily focus on one more than the other. For me, they both have to be there and they have to marry.
Right.
I'm not as descriptive as some other authors are because I don't visualize. I don't have that ability to see it play out. It literally is words on the page and it all sounds like dialogue to me. So
Yeah.
it's all about that conversation that's happening and does it make sense? Is that really what somebody would say to somebody else? And does it make
Mhm.
sense for this character? Because sometimes it might be something I would say, but that character is not me
Right.
and they wouldn't say that. So making sure that the things that happen make sense to marry the characters in the plot, because
Yeah.
that's what I read for. I don't read for
Right.
all the other descriptive details and all of that because I don't see it. So to me it's
Mhm.
like I love fantasy, but I can't read high fantasy because
Right.
I don't see it and it's just
You get
superfluous
lost in
words.
it. Mhm.
Right. And so I really need the characters to make sense in that story, and I need the story to make sense for those characters.
Makes a lot of sense. I also struggle a little bit with visualizing things, so I can relate to that. I had a question for you. How do you get to know your characters?
Honestly, through the way they behave in certain situations, I find
Mhm.
myself putting them in some random places, either with other people or by themselves just to see what they would do, when
Yeah.
this
Okay.
happens. And so it's really about how they behave in these situations, whether they're
Mhm.
positive, they're negative, they're just kind of chilling at home. What do you do when you're even by yourself? Are you
Right.
like me where your brain never shuts up? Or are you able to just hang out and kind of
Right.
around the house? That would be lovely. I would love to
I
be
know.
able to do
Must
that
be
at some
nice,
point.
right? Everyone who's able to turn off their brain to go to sleep. I'm like, how? Teach me,
Yeah.
please. I
I told
desperately
I
want to
told
know.
somebody I told somebody earlier on TikTok, I said, I don't trust people who say that they don't have things going on in their brain all the time. Like
Right.
how do you exist like that? I don't know. But yeah,
Right.
it's
Right.
really about how those characters behave. I did do the on my blog, I for my last novel, for You've Got Book Mail, I did do that, interview your character thing, but I had already
Yeah.
written, like, I had already written the story
Mhm.
was done, the characters were done, so I went back, and then with the fantasy, like, I did that for the main character. I was like, "But I already wrote the story." It wasn't a getting to know my
Right.
character, it was a sharing things about my character with
Yeah.
other people. I get to know them through the story as things
Okay.
happen, the same as my readers do.
Right. Right. Yeah, sounds fascinating. That's my favorite part of writing is getting to know the characters and the story and all of
Hmm.
that. Do you have a favorite author and what do you think they do well?
So if people ask me, who's my favorite author, it changes. It has changed over the years. But in recent years, my favorite author has been Sherilyn Kenyon, and she writes paranormal romance, but it isn't so much the paranormal or the romance that gets me. It is the way that she creates a world that feels like it makes sense. She integrates so much mythology, and I love mythology. And so she
Mm,
takes all of these different cultures and different mythologies and integrates them into this world, and they all marry together, like they know each
right.
other and they work together. And it's, unlike how sometimes we as humans don't interact very well with other cultures, all of those mythological creatures and beings and, humanoids, they all
Hmm.
still interact and generally work pretty well together.
Okay,
um
yeah.
and so I just love that she's able to bring that history and that mythology and that culture into a different space and still
Right.
make it make sense. Like it's still believable.
Hmm.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to check her out sometime. Yeah. Thanks for the rec. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, what would you say you've learned from the writing process?
I think I've learned more about myself through the
Hmm.
writing process than anything else. Like I said earlier, I was always an academic writer. And so I was very much, you outline, you know what you want to
Hmm.
say. So that way you can go ahead and say it and integrate your research and everything will be great. And the reason that I thought I couldn't write creatively is because I always tried to write in that same process.
With the
I would
plotting.
try to outline the story, right? I would try to go ahead and plot ahead of time. And what I found was my stories sounded like academic essays, and I didn't
Right.
like it. I didn't like it at all. And I was like, I'm no good at this. And then when I stopped plotting, it was just like, you know what? This is the story I want to tell. And this is
Hmm.
what needs to go into here. It
Yeah.
was much easier and it started to flow. And I ended up with that dialogue and I ended up with the conversations that needed to happen between the narrator and the reader. And I could approach it as a reader. Like I said, I get to learn my characters the
Hmm.
same way my readers do, right? Like I learn it through the story. And so that's what I've learned about myself, is that all of those rules that they've taught in school and all of the rules that I as a teacher have taught to my students don't work for me.
Right.
And I am much better writing creatively if I throw them away and
Yeah.
then come back to them for the revision and the editing portion of it.
No,
Hmm.
I love that. I tell people if you can't plot an outline ahead of time, just do an outline before you do edits because it's a great snapshot of big picture stuff. Like I have so much of character A, but character C is kind of falling off, as far as chapters or you can really see like what's balanced and unbalanced by looking at an outline like that. And
Mhm.
so I love that you say like you do return to like the outline and like looking at organization and structure with the editing because I think that that can be really helpful
Hmm.
for editing without taking away that creative freedom during the writing process.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I love how you bring up how doing it that way was great for academic papers and it was
Yeah.
great for research papers, but not necessarily good for creative writing.
Hmm.
So
Mhm.
I think
Right.
it's wonderful to realize that there are different methods, even with one person, to do four different
Yeah.
types of writing, and that when you tell yourself that there is only one way, and
Mhm.
anything else like isn't okay, and you can't do it, you can't explore it. I think that that
Hmm.
really stifles us.
It
So
Mhm.
does.
I think it's fun to try different things and see what works for you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. I did have a question. How did you go about making that switch then from the academic and the outline and all of that type of writing to the more creative stuff? Was it a lot of like experimenting? Was it a lot of just like giving yourself the freedom to try new things or
I think it was what I started with, right? Like,
Mhm.
not the musical, so to speak, even though that was kind of the impetus to start writing stories. But when I started writing that memoir, I didn't need to write it down. I knew what happened. It was my life, right? I just needed to figure out where the fantasy fit. And
Right.
so I allowed that to mirror what was happening in the memoir part
Mhm.
and gave myself the freedom to say, this is my story. Nobody
Right.
else needs to know how it's supposed to go, or
Mhm.
what stage they're going through, or what part of the plot outline are they in.
Right.
Nobody else needs to know that, because it's my story. It is literally my life and my story. And so that allowed me the freedom to be able to put all the pieces in play that needed to go into the story. And then
Mhm.
when I pulled it out, I was like, oh, this is still a story. I need to fill in some holes now, because
Right.
it is not shaping, the way that I'm approaching the memoir. Now it's becoming its own thing, but there's still, that plot was still there.
Mhm.
And so, it allowed that idea of, if I just give myself and those characters the freedom to be,
Right.
then they get to create rather than trying
Yeah.
to fit into that outline and that plot.
Yeah, no, I think it was kind of like the ideal project for you to work on to
Mhm,
discover your creative writing process too, because it's like, yes, it's about your life. And so you were the expert. You didn't have to sit there and say, like, well, I got to plot it out. And so it just gave you that freedom to just jump in and dive in feet first and get going with telling your story and figuring out that you are good at telling a story. You just
mhm.
feels contrived when you try and fit it into a box.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that for you. I think that yeah, like different projects really do require like a different approach as far as like our writing process. It's why we talk with everyone so much about writing process, so that everyone who's listening along at home can get different ideas because there's so many different ways of doing this. Even
Mhm.
though there's always those rules that people apply that say you have to do this hard and fast, like there's so many different ways to approach creative writing and the writing process, and so we love talking to everyone about
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So, how do you make time for writing since we're all very busy?
it. Hmm.
That is a great question on most days. So I have a group on TikTok that I write with. We write together almost every night. Recently, there's been a lot of life things happening, so we haven't. But since August, we have pretty much written together for 2, 3 hours every night. Some nights I get 2,000 words out. Some nights I get 200. But it allows me to stay in the habit of that writing mode, or at least in doing author things. Sometimes I'm not writing, sometimes I'm creating videos, sometimes,
Right.
I'm doing other stuff, marketing stuff or whatever, but I'm in that author mode as if it were another job.
Hmm.
So I work all day and then I come home and I do authorly things. And on the weekends, sometimes I spend all day writing and sometimes I don't even touch it. And
Right.
I had to learn to give myself the freedom to be like, okay, you have this expectation. Maybe you need that weekend off. You
Yeah.
wouldn't go to work 7 days a week, because I wouldn't, right? Some people do,
No.
but
Yeah.
I'm getting too old for that. So if you need to take a day or two off, or you're going on vacation or you're going out of town, you're no longer in school. There's nobody else's deadlines. I'm a self-published author. So
Hmm.
any deadlines are deadlines that I create.
Right.
And so I had to give myself the freedom to say, you can take some time off, even
Hmm.
though sometimes, you lose that habit quickly, right? Just like a lot of other authors, I have ADHD. And
Hmm.
so I forget about things for a long period of time. But having that group that I write with, I actually write with two different groups, but that group that I write with daily really
Yeah.
helps keep it focused. And then I have another group that I write with just on Sundays. So even if I have just kind of slacked off all week, I
Yeah.
know that on Sunday for 2 hours, we are sprinting. And that is what we're doing. So there are words that are going to get on the page regardless.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I have that scheduled on my calendar.
I love word sprints. I love that it's accountability built in, and I also love that it's just like it takes the self-doubt and the agonizing over like, oh, is this any good when I'm writing, because you're just trying to write as fast as you can, just get words down. It's how I've written most of my novels, is by participating in different writing sprints, because I find it very freeing to get rid of that overthinking, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I love that, you talk about taking weekends off, taking vacations and all that stuff, because it's like so true. We need to be as intentional with rest as we are with being productive and all of that stuff, because burnout is a very real thing that I think a lot of people are struggling with right now, is that you just like, I've always pushed myself in the past to just force my way through things, but you get to a point where it's like you need that rest, you need to recharge your creativity, your body, everything needs to be refilled, or else you can't keep creating.
It's a very good answer, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was very well put.
Especially when your mind is so busy, it is so easy to crack a whip over your head and constantly be like, you have to be productive. You have to write. When was the last time you wrote? Like when,
Right.
like to be unkind to yourself. It's so easy as an author.
Right.
It really
Or
is.
you get a new idea and you're like, okay, I have to explore this idea right now before I lose it. I have a Google Drive and I just have a ton of documents, and half of them have nothing but either a title or one sentence of something that popped in my head. And I'm like, I just need to get it out, and maybe I'll do something with it later.
Yes.
Maybe I won't,
Right.
but at least it's there. It exists. I know I'm not going to forget it. And I always have my phone with me, so I can always put it down, where everybody's like, oh, I didn't have a notebook or what. I always have my phone with me,
Yeah, same. It's
and
glued
so I'm
to
able
me,
to just
literally. Yes. Yeah, no, it's so important, because like a lot of times we, especially if you have ADHD, but all of us are guilty of this as writers, where we're like, oh, it's such a good idea, there's no way I'll forget it. 2 seconds later it's gone. Right? It's so important to capture it in the moment, get it out of your head, and then you can be like, okay, I can deal with this later, now let me go about my life. Yeah. Do you have a favorite part of writing?
Ooh, favorite part of writing. Anything that's not marketing. No. Let's see.
Right.
I think my favorite part of writing is when the story just starts to flow. Like just that moment where, okay, I've sat there with the blank page. I've gotten these first couple lines in. I'm starting to figure out where the characters are, and I'm agonizing over, is this going to work out or not? And then you hit that moment where you're like, this makes sense. Let's flow with this. And it just starts to flow out. I think that hitting that moment in that story, that's really where I'm going, right? Like that's that hit of dopamine, like, okay, all right, I got this. I can do this now.
Yeah, no, when you settle into that flow state and then your fingers just start going and you can hear the rhythm of the keys tapping and you're just like, oh, it's such a good feeling. Yeah.
It is the best feeling.
It really is a great feeling. Yeah. And you're just like, yeah.
Yeah, because if not, it's still agonizing, right? Like it's still work.
Right.
We can love writing, we can love creating, but at the end of the day, it is still work to get 65,000 words to make sense, 120,000 words to make sense. It's a job. But there are those moments, just like with any job, where it's just like, okay, I can do this.
Right. Getting into that flow state, getting that confidence in what's going on with the story. I love that. I like that you also said that like writing is hard work, because it's not easy and it doesn't always feel great when we're doing it, but we always love that we've done it. It reminds me of that quote where it's just like, when you're driving at night, like you maybe can't see more than a foot ahead of you, but you can make the journey the whole way doing that. So even if it feels hard to get into that flow state and it feels like you're in that agonizing, timid state where you're just writing, you can still accomplish a lot
Mhm.
by, just seeing a foot ahead of you and not knowing where you're going, but just keep moving forward, you can still accomplish a lot. But it is such a great feeling when you are able to like get into that flow and just like the story starts coming out fast.
So what influences your writing?
Just everyday life,
Mhm.
like my characters, I want them to feel like real people, even if they're fantasy, even if
Right.
they're fantastical creatures, I still want them to feel like real people. And so, like, situations and conversations and relationships, I want them to feel genuine,
Mhm.
and so I think that the biggest influence for me, even in my poetry, right, is something happens, something snaps, something clicks, and it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I could see myself doing this. I could see this person I know, they would totally do this, or they would say that, or they would act like this, or I see, and I love old couples. I love couples who
Mhm.
have been together for like 30, 40, 50 years. I think it's like the sweetest thing ever. And so I'm like, huh, what if I had an older couple who is now like a mentor to this new couple happening
Mhm.
right here, And so it really is those everyday things that I see
Right.
that I'm like, how can I capture that and
Mhm.
put it into a story, or capture it and put it into a poem? How can I get that feeling that I get when I see them at the
Yeah.
store or in the park holding hands? How can I get that feeling and put it on a page?
That's one of the things I love about poetry in general is it's great at practicing just distilling a feeling or a certain situation into a few words, right? And so
Mhm.
getting that practice of being able to encapsulate that feeling you get when you see
Mhm.
that loving old couple, and then it like having that in your tool belt is so helpful too though when
Mhm.
you're writing stories of being like, I have a few sentences I want to devote to this. How can I put the most bang for my buck? So I love poetry for that reason. Even if you don't feel great at poetry or you don't feel like you are skilled enough to do it, practicing that skill is so helpful.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I think that we still love to read poetry for that reason because it's so great at just, like I said, distilling an emotion in a few words. And you just have that feeling when you're done reading and you're just like, oh, that was so great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever deal with writer's block? And if so, how do you kind of work through it?
Yes and no. So I sometimes get stuck on one work in progress. I can always fall back on poetry. So that's usually
Yeah.
what I do is I bounce back and forth. So if I am really emotionally charged, if my anxiety is up a lot of times the
Mhm.
stories won't flow, but I can always go
Mhm.
back to poetry because that is where I pour all of those emotions and that stress and
Yeah.
everything else into. But sometimes I just need to write another story. Like I need to leave this one set for a moment and
Right.
just go and write something else. So I know that there are some authors out there who are like, I got to start with this story and I got to finish this story all the way to the end. And
Mhm.
that's the way that it's got to go. And I'm like, I don't necessarily do that. If it's not
Right.
flowing for me at all, if I can't get the next sentence down on the page, then I'm gonna try something else. So, or maybe I'll
Right.
try a new story, or, so I usually have 4 or 5 different things going on at the same time. But generally, my backup plan is if I'm stuck, I'm gonna write a poem. I'm
Yeah.
going to figure out something that is bothering me that I need to get out in
Right.
words.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of jumping around from project to project.
Mhm.
It's the way my mind works. I used to do that with reading even where I'd have several books and if I got to a tense moment with one book or I was like my anxiety can't handle that today, I'd switch to something cozier and like, just working with what mood I'm in, right?
Mhm.
That can be very helpful
Coincidentally,
with writing too.
sorry.
Oh, go
Coincidentally,
ahead.
that was just what we were talking about before we started the show, where I was like, I'm really stuck. Maybe I just need to work on something else for a little while. I
Mm-hmm.
can
Mhm.
take the pressure
Right,
off this
right.
one project for a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves where we're like, I want it out by this time. I have this deadline. Even if it's self-enforced, it can still
Hmm.
be a lot of pressure. And then you're just sitting there saying, like, how do I meet this deadline? And then it's hard to get the words to come. Or you need to let the story percolate a little bit and like figure
Right.
out the background details of what's going on in the back of your head while you do something else.
Or
Mhm.
you know something's not working. You have this, you're
Yes,
like, there's something that just doesn't sound right, feel right. It's just
right,
not
right.
working, but I can't figure out what it is. I need to step away from it,
Yes,
and
yes.
then, it'll start to figure itself out.
Absolutely. And you're like, wait, is this actually garbage and bad, or is it just that I read it 100 times and I'm used to it and I made it so I don't,
And I'm hungry and
and I'm
irritated,
hungry
so I
and I'm
hate it. You know
tired
what I mean?
and
Like, I hate my
Right.
writing all the time, and it most
Do
of
I
the time
eat
it's because I'm
Snickers or do I just
yeah,
really suck? Like,
right, right. That's right.
so
Mhm.
Angry.
there's just all this like anxiety over the
Mhm.
quality of your work and if you're doing well enough and but
Right.
you know, yeah.
Mhm.
I
This is
find
a
that
very
Absolutely.
stressful job sometimes.
it
You
is.
know,
Mhm.
I
we're
find that
banging our heads against the wall, we're crying over our keyboards, and the people in our lives are like, "Why are you doing this?" And you're like, "It's my favorite thing, okay?"
It's like, I love it and I hate it, and I love it and I hate it.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. The struggle. Yes.
Yeah.
No. I was just gonna say, I think that that pressure builds too when you're working on a series because you're just like, book one, great, that was done, got that out. How do I make book two even better? And so every book that you
Yes.
continue to write in a series, you're like, but it has to be better than the last one, and you feel like you don't know if you have that in you to make it better, and then that just gives to the overthinking and anxiety and
Yeah.
getting
And
stuck.
especially if it's a true series, because you're like, not only do I want it to get better, but it's still got to connect. Like it still
Yes,
has to,
right,
it has to flow from however many words I wrote before, like a year
right.
ago. I still
Yeah,
have
and
to
like carrying
continue
all
that
those threads
storyline.
through. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it is not easy. For sure. Oh goodness, yeah. I found that like writing my first book, even though I had to write it 3 times, I was so happy about the process. And then it came to write book two, and I was just like, I'm the worst writer ever because I was like trying to make it bigger and better, and I just like, yeah, I was putting too much pressure on myself.
Hmm.
So the next is Kirsha's favorite question to ask. So I'm gonna let you go ahead.
Yes. What has been your most significant writing victory so far?
Um, Gosh, what has been? I think just, the fact of not only finishing something,
Mm,
finishing a project, finishing a poem, finishing a collection, finishing a story, is getting it out there. You
mhm.
know, stopping myself from that fear of rejection that,
Right.
is so real. Um, I tell people, my anxiety won't let me query. I can't.
Mhm.
There's absolutely no way that I could sit around for 6, 8, 10 months waiting to find out that people hate it.
Right.
I'm just going to put it out there. And so I think that being able to finish a project to its end and then put it out there and let it be itself
Mhm.
is probably the biggest thing. So like I have 4 books out now,
Yes.
and they're all different. There's
Yeah.
2 romance, 1 poetry, 1 children's book.
Mhm.
Um but they're all out there, and
Yeah.
they're living their lives. And
Yeah, no.
I think that's the big thing. It's kind of like, you rear your children and then they go out there and they live their lives, and you kind of
Right.
watch from the sidelines and you're like, okay, is this still a reflection of me, or are they just their own thing at this point? And I just, am the proud mama and I say, hey, look at what I made. Look at what I
Yes.
made. And
Yes.
some days I don't like it. Some days I don't like what they're doing. But you know
Right.
what? I still made that. I still made
Yes.
that.
No, you're right. It's definitely something to be proud of, not just finishing a book, but getting it out into the world and letting that go. because I mean, especially with ADHD, rejection is huge, right? Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is like a thing, right? And we really struggle with that because when you have ADHD, you're just rejected for being who you are so often that it becomes terrifying to imagine rejection, even like perceived rejection. So yes, you should absolutely be so proud that you're like, not only did I do something that only like 3% of Americans have done, which is finish a book, but like I also then was like, screw anybody's opinion. I'm also going to put it out into the world for people to enjoy or not enjoy, and that's totally fine. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes. No, I love that. And I do have to say, like, even if you do feel like, oh, I'm getting a ton of bad reviews on this, or even if you just get one bad review, like look up your favorite authors' 1-star reviews and you will feel so much better. You are in great company if you have a 1-star review.
Right. Yeah. I don't trust books that only have 5-star reviews because
nobody does.
Because I don't like every book I've read. Like I don't rate every book I've read a 5 stars. So I'm like, does everybody really love that?
Or is it just their friends who reviewed and
Yes.
Or do they just feel bad for us? Which, that's real too. I appreciate those. You feel bad for me, 5 stars. I appreciate that.
We'll take it.
But the reality is, right, not every book is for every person. Everybody has a different reason that they read, the same way that we have different reasons that we write. And so to say that, oh my God, this is perfect and everybody loves it, that's not realistic. That's not realistic.
No. And it also helps, like, when you do get a bad review, to just know that sometimes someone picks up a book and they're like, I don't like piracy books, but I'm reading one. And so they leave a poor review. It has nothing to do with your story,
Right.
It's just not the right fit with the audience sometimes.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine contact me and she's like, I really liked your book, but I didn't love it. I would give it 3 stars. And I'm like, please give it 3 stars. Go on Amazon, go on Goodreads, give it 3 stars. I need a greater variety of stars here.
Right.
Because so far it's only been the 5 stars and the 1 stars. Like there's no
There's no in between.
Yeah. So I was like, please put it up. Like, don't be afraid. We're still friends. It's good. You're still doing me a favor. A review is still gold, please.
Yes. And I hate that, like, there's this kind of like this feeling among writers where they say, like, oh, if it's not a 4 or 5 star, don't rate it. Like, reviews are for readers anyways, and that 2-star review that you don't want could sell your book to another reader, because what they say they don't like could be exactly what somebody's looking for in a book. So, like, don't hate on lower star reviews, and a 3-star is not bad. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's like saying 70% is failing. Like, it's not, so.
Yeah. I mean, I got a 3-star review on this recent book and she was like, I don't like a story within a story. And I'm like, that's cool. But everybody else is asking me now to write that story that was in a story as its own book. So what you didn't love, like, is exactly what other people were loving about, the story. And so it just goes to show, like I said, we all do this for different reasons. We write for different reasons. We like different things and we read for different reasons. And it just didn't resonate with you. That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, and it's a great advertisement for somebody who is looking for, oh, that sounds like a fantastic concept. I'd love to know more. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you reading anything currently?
So most of my reading nowadays is audiobooks because I drive a lot for work and my commute to work in addition to driving for work. So right now I am about 24 hours into A Day of Fallen Night, which is the sequel to Priory of the Orange Tree, which was also about 36 hours long. So
yes.
It's a big one. It's a big one. But so I've been reading it for a while and I've read 2 other books interjected in there because I was like, okay, I need something else. It's great, but it's taking so long.
Right. Gotta spice things up with shorter audiobooks as
Absolutely.
well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's the only thing that I'm reading right now. Usually I have an audiobook, a Kindle book, and a physical book going at the same time.
Mhm.
But in trying to get these stories out, I have a couple of anthology stories I need to get
Yeah.
finished for different events that are happening. So they have deadlines that are not my deadlines. So I need to get
Right.
those done. And so I'm like, okay. And I'm trying to record my audiobooks. And so
Right.
all of my time at home is just stuck on writing,
Right.
or recording. And so when I'm in the car, that's when I get to read.
Yeah, so you're doing your own recordings for your
I
audiobooks? That's
am.
so amazing. Yes. Do
I
you
am.
do different voices for the characters? Like, do you do the voice acting?
Yes,
Wow,
I
that's
do.
so amazing. Oh, I love
I do.
that. I
Yeah.
feel like I would be one, I would be self-conscious about doing it, but two, I would forget what voice goes to which. Because I'm not a
So
voice actor.
funny that you say that. I started
Yeah.
recording this one about a month ago, and then I got sick. And
Oh, yeah.
then I wasn't able to record because the weather, because if I don't have a studio built yet, so I
Right,
just
right.
have my microphone with its little, enclosure trying to dampen any of the noise.
Mm,
And so then I got sick again and I lost my voice. So I hadn't
mm.
recorded for a month. I was like, I don't remember any of these voices. So I literally
Oh,
just
yeah.
started back over yesterday at
Yeah.
chapter
Yeah.
one because I was like, even if I listen to it, that doesn't mean I'm going to catch the same voice
Right.
because it
Mhm.
has been
Right.
so long.
Muscle
I don't
memory.
try to change my voice too much, but enough
Right.
that you can hear the difference between the characters.
With the
But I've
dialogue.
I've
Yeah.
been recording books, like I taught high school, and I taught high school kids who were reading on a second and third grade level. And so I would always record the books that we were reading for them. It was back before audiobooks became a big thing and they were all,
Right. Right.
available. And so I would literally the day before they were to read a chapter, I was at home recording that chapter for
Yes.
them.
Yes.
So I was like,
No. Yeah.
right now I am a poor broke educator writing
Yes.
books that cost money. And so I'm just going to record my own.
No, very,
Mhm.
you've had lots of practice and it's an amazing thing if you're able to do it. I wish I was better at memory and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I was just kind of laughing because it's just like, it's so true. I'm not a teacher, but I'm a tutor. And it's just like the lesson planning and the frantic trying to get the lesson done the day before. And you're just like, I gotta get it ready. So I was just laughing that
Mhm.
you're just like talking about recording the stories the night before. But
Mhm.
what a good way to supplement education of saying like these students are struggling with reading, let me record the story for them so that they can have both to learn how to read better. Like
Yep.
that's amazing to be adaptable that way
Mhm.
and supplement your lessons with something so helpful.
Do you have any writing advice that you dislike, hate, doesn't work for you?
Absolutely. The advice that says don't edit while you write. I can't do
Okay.
it. That's
Yeah.
not how my brain works. And so I because I need to keep that continuity, right? I don't have that movie playing in my head that other people have. And so whatever I write today, when I come back to it tomorrow, I am editing that part that I wrote today just so that I remember where I am
Where
in the
you're
story
going.
and what needs to come next. And so by the time I get done with my first draft, it really does look like a third or fourth draft because I
Yeah.
have been editing all the way through. But I don't go back to the beginning unless I've taken like a week off from it. I don't
Right.
go back and reread the whole thing. It is just, okay, this is what I wrote yesterday. This is
Right.
where I was going, but let me clean it up while I'm doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. I know a lot of great authors that do edit as they go, and it's very helpful. I think the
Mhm,
idea behind that advice is that if we are editing, we're being critical, we're being analytical, which can kind
mhm,
of be the opposite of what we need when we're being creative. It's just about as many ideas as we can generate and not worrying about if they're good ideas or bad ideas. But like I said, I've read some fantastic books by people, and they're like, I do edit as I go. They do the exact same
Mhm,
thing you do, where they start with reading what they wrote last time to kind of find their place in the story, see where they're going,
mhm.
and kind of get that refresher. Um,
mhm.
Yeah, I
yeah,
always say I'm a pantser, but I'm not chaotic. I can't.
Okay, yeah,
I can't
yeah.
be, because I have some chaotic pantser friends who they're like, oh yeah, I had this scene in my head. I just wrote this scene. And oh yeah, I had this scene in my head and I just
Right,
wrote this scene. Let me go back to chapter 2 now. And I'm like, what?
right,
What?
right. How
How
do
did
you keep track of
what?
it all? Yes.
I don't get it. And then they're like, yes.
Yeah.
And now I need a developmental editor. And I'm like, no wonder, because you have jumped all over the place. You
Right,
don't know where you are. Like, I don't know where
right,
you are.
right.
You don't know where
Yeah,
you are. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I can't be that level of chaotic. I still have to
yeah,
write it in order. I made the mistake. I was writing a thriller. I decided last year, I'm going to write this thriller, had this idea in my head. And I was writing it. And then all of a sudden I knew what was going to happen at the end. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to write the end. I haven't touched it since.
because you felt
Because
you
I'm like,
completed it. Your
I
brain is
know
like,
what's
it's
happening.
done. I finished it.
It's
Yeah,
done.
yes. Oh my
Yeah.
God. I
And it
hate
was
when
so
my brain
good. I
does
was
that
so
to
excited
me.
about it, but
Right,
I don't know
right.
how you do it. I don't know how you do it. Like
Well,
I'm
yeah.
always so excited when I read those books because I'm like, it's like magic. How, how chaotic writers pull it together and make it into a story, because my anxiety goes up every time I listen to them describe their
Mhm.
process. I'm like, wow,
You
how do you
mentioned
do that?
how when you get an idea that is distracting you from what you're working on, you go to a separate document and you write it down, right?
Mhm.
I do that. I'll create separate documents of different characters and those scenes. So when I get to that scene in the main story, I go to that document, pull that chunk out, integrate it into where I'm at, and
Oh,
then keep
yeah.
going. That way, the
Hmm.
scene that was in my head isn't lost.
Right,
Because I
right.
will lose it
But
if I
there's
don't
some
write it down
method to
now.
what you're doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I leave it open enough that when I'm ready for it, I can plug it into where I'm going and fill out the details.
Oh,
But I
yeah.
have to capture it
Okay.
somehow.
So you kind
So,
of like are creating like your own jigsaw puzzle and kind of piecing it in as you go along and putting the pieces together.
yeah, or like if you're weaving together, and you're like, there's that thread, I'll grab that and pop it in, and because I have so many different points of view, and then I mix past and present and future like
Right.
together.
It's all about
So I
bringing
have
it
to
in.
make sure that they become cohesive so that the character, the reader isn't whipped around. They don't get whiplash
Right,
Mhm.
right.
going from character to character. So it's really tricky, and I don't recommend.
Yes, yes. It's
I don't
stressful.
recommend it, but unfortunately, it's my process right now.
But it
It's what
works
we
for
do.
you.
Yeah.
It works
Because
for you, and you get to the end, whatever the
I
end
get to the
happens to
end,
be.
and people
Yeah.
read it and they go, "How do you do this? This is so good. It's so tricky, and all the
Yeah,
plot
yeah.
and the misleading and deception." I'm like, "Oh, it just comes together."
Yeah. With a lot of heartache,
Magic.
pulling out
Magic.
hairs.
That's what it is. It's
Yes,
Yes,
magic.
I have a magic wand, and it makes a book, and it's
yes, I wish.
yes, there is no magic wand. There is no way. You have to
Elves
slog
in the
through that
night.
mire
Yes.
and find your
Yeah.
story.
Mhm.
Right,
Absolutely.
right. But there's so many ways you can do it. That's
Mhm.
that's the
Mhm.
good thing, is that we can figure out what works for ourselves and go with that.
Mhm.
Well, we do want to give you an opportunity to let our audience know where they can find out more about you and your book. So go ahead and share your socials and any websites or any announcements you have.
So my website is B Isabel Writes. No dots, no nothing. BIsabelWrites.com. On there, you'll find poetry. You'll find links to my socials for Bobbie Isabel. You will also find a section for Leia Lane. That's where I put all the trigger warnings, and it says 18 plus, explicitly on the website. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok under both names. On what's the new one? Threads. I'm on there too. I am terrible about keeping up with all of them, but my brain says you have to be on all of them because that's
Right,
how, it's
right.
going to work. So you'll find me really, really busy on one this week, and then the next week it'll be a different one that I'm,
Right.
really focused on. And so, but I'm there and I'm accessible on all of them. And you'll find, just sometimes nonsense. And sometimes I talk about my writing, and sometimes I talk about my friends
Yeah.
and their writing. because I love to share them. I do have a newsletter. So if you go to my website and you click on newsletter, sign up, there's a newsletter and there's a discount code in the newsletter for anything that's on my shop, for any of my signed copies or whatever. They're all on there as well.
Oh, very nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm so glad you're able to take time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Absolutely. I appreciate it.
Yes. So thank you so much again. And thank you to everyone who's listening along at home. Remember, there's more than one way up a mountain, and our next episode will air Friday as usual. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, you can find us on social media at The Tell Not Show, or email us at thetellnotshow@gmail.com. Thanks so much again.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed the show, consider subscribing and liking. We appreciate all the support. Julia J.K. Allen is an author, editor, and coach, and can be found at hijingsrudder.com.
Kirsha Fox is an author, avid reader, gamer, and mother to four, and you can find her at kirshafox.com. Thanks and see you next time.